Government Business Order of the Day number 2, Design and Building Practitioners Bill 2019, resumption of the interrupted debate of the question on the motion of Mr Tudor Hope that this bill be now read a second time. Mr Shoebridge speaking.
Mr David Shoebridge.
Mr Deputy President, which explains why it is some time since we spoke on this bill, and I was just double checking with colleagues and the diary. The last time was the 19th of November, in the year of some people's Lord, 2019.
You're much funnier this time.
Yes, and there's a lot has happened since we were here last on the 19th of November.
Well, even in the last 24 hours.
And indeed, a lot has happened in the last 24 hours. I acknowledge that interjection.
Nothing focuses the
but can I say one of the key things that's changed has been the dreadful pandemic that we've had, and clearly all parties, I think, have focused their minds on wanting to ensure that if we are going to see significant investment in wages and in infrastructure coming out of this to help us through this pandemic, that to the extent that there's investment in infrastructure and construction in particular, and to the extent that there's investment in the residential construction sector, we need to make sure that we don't just have a multi-billion-dollar repeat of previous mistakes of building defects and the disasters that we have seen. We are convinced of that. And for that reason, there has been ongoing and further negotiations with the government and with key stakeholders, whether it's unions or professional bodies, other key stakeholders, and discussion amongst the crossbench and with the opposition, and I've got to say fruitful conversations with the Minister and his office. That has resulted in what I hope we will see through the rest of this evening as an agreed package of reforms. I want to be clear on behalf of the Greens, we don't think this goes far enough. We remain committed to the need for a building commission, and with this reform, together with an agreed set of reforms that the House will see on Thursday, which will give increased powers to the building commission and real power to the building commissioner, and for the first time establish the building commissioner in law, goes some way to what we think is needed to re-establishing standards in the industry. But those negotiations have been fruitful. We've come to an agreement that we will allow these reforms to bed down and then review them with an eye to whether we need a building commission and expanded reforms early in 2022. We've come to an agreed position to ensure that we can actually, for the first time ever in New South Wales, establish a proper register and certification scheme for engineers, a desperately needed reform. And we've come to an arrangement on some critical changes about duty of care to ensure homeowners have proper remedies in place. This is hard work and important reforms. None of the complex discussions that we've done will probably find themselves, in key media stories. But collectively, I think what we've done is we've taken some quite significantly flawed reforms. We have put significant improvements in them. We've brought on board the concerns that have come from key stakeholders to make sure this legislation will stand up and do part of what it's intended to do, which is go a significant way to re-establishing standards in the building industry. And I think we've done it in a way which is more collaborative than I could have imagined some 7 or so months ago when we were doing it. And I think part of that is explained by us collectively realising that this pandemic is real, that we have a job to do collectively as legislators to try and do what we can to re-establish standards and to ensure that as we go into this hopefully significant increase in building after this pandemic, we produce buildings that people can trust to live in as homes, because surely that's everybody's goal.
Thank you. Further contributions? I'll go to the opposition in terms of rotating between the different groups. So the Honourable Courtney Hussos.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Deputy President, I rise to make a contribution on the Design and Building Practitioners Bill 2020 now, 2019 as it was, as the previous speaker reflected, it has been 7 months since the House first undertook and began debate on this issue. And I referred tonight to the notes that I'd made at the time, and I reflected that there was a crisis in the building industry. Now, obviously, events and global events have certainly subsumed that, and we operate in a very different world to the world that we undertook the initial inquiry as a member of the Public Accountability Committee that undertook the inquiry into the building industry in New South Wales. But I do think that it's useful to reflect upon, despite the length of time passing since that inquiry, I do think it's useful to reflect upon that inquiry in my contribution tonight, because to be perfectly frank, I was horrified by some of the testimony, and I know that some of my colleagues on the committee felt a similar way, because we obviously have the very well-known and well-publicised examples of Mascot Tower and Opal Tower, and they are the most public examples of, I would characterise it as a tsunami of defects that are gripping the state. And I don't say that lightly. I say that because there is a Deakin University report that shows that 97% of the buildings in New South Wales have defects. And that contrasts with Victoria, that has 74%, and Queensland, that has 71%. And in New South Wales, the buildings that do have defects have on average 16 defects per building. Now, these may be small, but in many cases they are large. And the reason why we don't know the specifics of those, that we refer to Mascot and we refer to Opal so frequently, is because there is a significant financial incentive in owners not publicising the extent of the defects that are plaguing their buildings. This is the major financial investment that most people will make. And as we heard from Mascot, so powerfully in the building inquiry, from the Mascot residents in particular, that they felt they had done everything in their power, but were left facing financial ruin. Just last week in the newspaper, it was reported that the financial situation that they found themselves in meant that that one particular owners, they weren't having a second child because they found themselves in the grip of this financial crisis that through no fault of their own, they were in. And that goes to the importance of the bill that we are debating tonight. The bill that we are debating tonight was held up by the minister as being their response to this crisis. Now, the Building Commissioner, I will just start with the Building Commissioner, because this was the office that was supposed to be charged with heading the government's response. Now, I respect his experience in the industry, but initially he was given 4 or 5 staff. Now that over time has been increased. In fact, I might even say that it seems as though he's trying to build a commission by stealth within the Department of Fair Trading where he's operating. But that is not enough. After 3 months in the job, his advice to homeowners was buyer beware and that they should be more diligent. Not that the certification certificates that owners rely on, that the information that underpins them should actually be improved. Now, the government doesn't even mention the Building Commissioner in the bill tonight. I understand, and obviously time has moved on since we first began debating this, that we will probably later this week debate a bill that will give the Building Commissioner explicit powers. I note that this was something that when he first appeared before the inquiry, we suggested. We suggested he would need more staff, that he would need specific powers, that he would need a building commission. Well, we're 2/3 of the way there, and I would suggest that eventually a government of some description will come to understand that we need a new approach to building regulation in this state. This government has consistently said that construction will lead the recovery out of the current economic crisis that we find our way in. And indeed, we expect in coming days that the federal government will announce a specific package for the housing sector and for the construction sector. We can't repeat the mistakes of the past. My colleague, the Honourable John Graham, my colleague on the building inquiry, we've been on this journey together, and it's been a slightly terrifying one at times, I'll say. He said, this is an economic stimulus without a safety net. And that's exactly the situation that we find ourselves in. We must ensure that this economic recovery is underpinned by good building practices, by a building industry that is well regulated, by a building industry that is not leaving homeowners holding the can and the certification certificates that they rely on actually mean more than the paper than they're written on. Now, we did hold a specific hearing on the 5th of November last year into this bill, some 8 months ago now, and witness after witness came before us to explain the serious shortcomings. Now, the Minister indicated that this was the first tranche of reforms that the government was expecting to make as part of a bigger overhaul of the building sector. But that goes to the very heart of the issue that we are debating tonight, which is this is one more piecemeal approach. In 2015, one of the key recommendations to this government from Mr. Lambert, who outlined a clear action plan of what we need to do, was that we need a standalone Building Act, principles-based and written in plain English. My concern with the bill tonight, and I understand that there have been negotiations to improve it, and I look forward to supporting those amendments in the Committee of the Whole, is that we need one standalone Building Act. We need a new agency responsible for administering the building industry that's headed by a statutory office of a building commissioner. Even the UDIA in their submission said to us the systems don't work together. The Design and Practitioners Bill doesn't work in with the existing regulation. And we even had a witness who said, Mr. Brett Daintree, very informative, who said that this may even exacerbate the existing shortcomings. The lack of detail in the bill, the fact that this bill will only apply to Class 2 buildings, the fact that too much will be left to the regulations, we have architects particularly concerned about the differing responsibilities. And I will just quickly speak to the amendments that Labor will move tonight and that I will be very proudly supporting. We will aim to establish a registration scheme for engineers. It seems absurd that we are the only state where anyone can hang a shingle out and call themselves an engineer. In fact, we're in Victoria and in Queensland, where they actually have a registration scheme for engineers, you can be deregistered as an engineer and cross the border and hang your shingle out and start charging for services all over again with no recourse from a consumer in New South Wales. It is just an absurd situation that we find ourselves in. So, Mr. Deputy President, I will reluctantly vote for the passage of this bill. I do so in the hope that it can be amended to be improved during the Committee of the Whole. I do continue to question the ability of the Department of Fair Trading to appropriately regulate the building industry. The Building and Development Certifiers Act, which was rushed through the Parliament late in 2018, took more than 18 months to come into effect. During the public hearing into this bill, representatives of the department conceded that those regulations had not been prioritised. This is weeks after Opal Tower happened, weeks after this bill passed the House. Mascot Towers happened 6 months later. As families, owners, tenants were literally forced from their homes, it really makes you wonder what the department was prioritising at this time. We need a new approach to regulation of the building industry in New South Wales. We have now 2 reports from the Public Accountability Committee outlining a clear plan of action. This is not what the bill tonight contains. We need a standalone act. We need a building commission. We need a building commissioner with statutory authority and an expert advisory panel. We need a registration scheme for engineers, and we need a single senior building minister to deal with this issue. The people of New South Wales deserve better.
The Honourable Fred Nile.
Thank you, Mr Acting President. I rise to speak on behalf of the Christian Democratic Party in relation to the Design and Building Practitioners Bill 2019. Among its various provisions, this bill seeks to regulate the business and professional operations of an important industry, namely the design, building and construction industry. I know that many of us who are not involved with the construction industry or building industry have been very concerned over media reports over the last 2 or 3 years about the problems in the construction of particularly high-rise apartment accommodation in Sydney. And the residents who bought those units have been very angry at the construction faults in those apartment buildings. So I'm hopeful that this bill will provide the protection for future individuals who do buy units to know they're getting trustworthy buildings that have been properly certified, built by qualified people and don't have any construction faults. And that's the reason that the CDP supports this bill. I'll make some comments about correspondence I received from Engineers Australia, which is the peak representative body for the industry that will be directly affected by this law. Engineers Australia was originally established by Royal Charter in 1919 to advance the science and practice of engineering for the benefit of the community. Of their 10,000 members, 25,000 work in New South Wales. Engineers Australia has expressed its support for the amendments to the bill. In the most recent communication to me, Jonathan Russell, the National Manager, Public Affairs and Policy Advocacy for Engineers Australia, wrote, quote, "Of most concern to Engineers Australia is the inclusion of laws to require professional engineers to be registered to practice and for it to apply to engineering work in any industry," end of quote. According to Mr Russell, the proposed amendments now address his organisation's concerns. The proposed registration scheme will now apply to professional engineers in 5 areas of practice: civil, structural, mechanical, electrical and fire safety. Other areas can be added to the scheme by the way of regulations passed in the future. This registration mandate will apply to professionals working in the building sector as well as public infrastructure, manufacturing and supply of essential services. Mr Russell in his correspondence informed me that these reforms have the support of 80% of his members. Now, I hope he can convince the other 20% to be as enthusiastic. That is an overwhelming vote of confidence from industry itself. However, I have received other correspondence from concerned stakeholders in regard to aspects of this bill. One is Mr Josie Grando of Stantec, which is an international business that operates in New South Wales, employing designers, engineers and other scientists, who wrote to me in regard to ambiguities in the bill. Mr Grando is concerned that the statutory duty of care contained in section 31 does not deliver the necessary consumer protections. He writes, quote, "In fact, it could have significant negative impact on insurance and the ability of consumers to recover economic costs." He goes on to say in his letter to me, dated the 2nd of March, "We know that insurers can and do modify their policies when there is a significant risk of action in certain areas. We believe there is," this is in his letter to me, "we believe there is real risk because of the drafting ambiguities in the bill that insurers will remove coverage for claims made under the statutory duty of care. Alternatively, premiums will be unbearably high. If there is no insurance to cover claims, then there is essentially no consumer protection in the bill." Now, I'm sure members will agree these are serious and important concerns that go to a vital point in the proposed legislative reform. They are made, however, based on the perception that the drafting of section 31 is ambiguous. My understanding of the section is that it establishes a clear duty of care which operates, quote, as if it were the common law. The words in subsection 3 in brackets are, as if, in quotes. This suggests to me that the common law is not displaced. It is simply the case that the statute is to operate along the same lines as the common law doctrines of duty of care. I would appreciate if the government were to clarify in its speech and reply how this part of the legislation is to be interpreted in the event that the question is involved in litigation at some future point of time. I would also appreciate if the government could draw attention to the insurance industry's implications of this section and outline how this aspect of the bill was drafted in connection to stakeholder engagement. I also note that while the bill title mentions design and building, section 31, which establishes the duty of care, mentions construction. That term is defined in section 30 as, quote, A, building work, B, the preparation of regulated designs and other designs for building work, C, the manufacture or supply of a building product used for building work. I see no problems with the drafting here. However, I commend the government in its attempt to regulate the industry so as to ensure best practice among New South Wales engineers. And that's the reason why the Christian Democratic Party will vote for this bill.
Honourable John Graham.
Thank you, Deputy President. I welcome this debate. It has been some time, as my colleague has observed, that since the 10th of November that we've joined this discussion. But I'm glad that it's back on the agenda. That not only is it back, but it's in a much better state than the last time we left it. In between, of course, much has happened, and one of the things that we saw was the release of a report from that committee that's already been referred to, the Public Accountability Committee, that called for this debate, called for the resumption of this debate because action was urgently needed. And it was an unusual call. What was an extraordinary call, the thing that accompanied it, was that committee also called for another bill that this parliament hadn't even seen to be brought forward. Such were the gaps in regulation in this industry that you saw a committee of this House calling for action, calling for legislation to be brought forward that members of this House hadn't seen, but they knew that action was required. And I'm pleased to see on that matter also. The government has now acted, the minister's now acted, the parliament will now debate that legislation as well. That's part of the extraordinary backdrop to us being here today and having this debate. It was very important as the government ramped up construction, got the planning system moving, really fired up those approvals to have some urgent protections in place. It was a stimulus without a safety net, without that. There were statements made about how we'd avoid another wave of defects as these projects move through the planning system. And without changes to the law, there was no safety net, there was no protection, there was no guarantee that we wouldn't simply have defects of the sort that my colleagues have talked about. Look, it's been I do want to commend the Public Accountability Committee process. It's been a very good committee once again of this House, and all the members, government and non-government, have worked well together. It has been quite confronting as people have turned up. Having invested their life savings, the biggest financial decision they'll make in their lives, put it into a property, and for some of those people it's gone horribly wrong. We've had people turn up and tell those stories. We've had them turn up and just explain that they just didn't know where to turn. They didn't know how to get advice. And in the instance of cladding in particular, having done the right thing, having taken serious steps to remove it, we had instances where people were unable to clarify whether if they put cladding back on, if they remedied that work, they couldn't be guaranteed they wouldn't have to remove that again. They just couldn't get the advice about what would and would not be banned down the track. And even as you knew those things in the committee process, so you knew there were problems out there, each committee hearing we did, a new wave of homeowners or affected people would come in and tell their stories, and you just walked out reminded it is actually worse than you'd even realised. And I want to talk about just why that's a problem, not just for these homeowners, but actually for New South Wales. Because I think the way this is talked about publicly in the public discussion is it's real. It is like gambling. You put your money, your life savings, your biggest financial investment in a house. You hope that you're lucky. That's really what's going on there. That's you spin the housing roulette wheel and you hope that your house won't be the one with major defects that you couldn't detect. Doesn't matter, even if you've got experience, even if you have a buyer's agent, even if you go through all the steps you should, you couldn't detect. But the waterproofing fails, there's a major problem with the building that you wouldn't have known about. You spin the roulette wheel and you're either lucky or unlucky. That's how we talk about it. That's the public discussion. I think two things that I'd really caution the House that we've really learnt over the course of it is just how widespread the problem is. So it is more widespread than the public discussion. And that's because there is a lack of disclosure here and incentives against disclosure. Incentives against disclosure on behalf of the builders, the developers, the people who are hoping to sell these houses, but also on behalf of strata committees, on behalf of people who are worried about what happens if there is the spotlight does turn to their building, to their investment, to their life savings. What does that mean for their financial future? So it is just clearly more widespread than you would think from the public discussion. But secondly, it is actually having an impact right across the board on the property market in New South Wales. It is having a systemic effect. It doesn't matter where you are on the roulette wheel. It doesn't matter if you spin the wheel and you come up lucky or unlucky. This is to such an extent, when you talk to building professionals or people impacted by it, it is driving a loss of confidence in sectors of the property market in New South Wales. It's casting doubt over every property in a certain period, in a certain class. That is the risk here. You might be lucky, but your home value is still dropping in New South Wales because this problem is not properly regulated. That is the problem in a systemic effect. So even if you come up lucky on this one, you are losing money because this industry is not being properly regulated and other people are turning up unlucky. That is what's going on here. So turning to the action here, it is very good news that there is now an agreement here. We will see action in the course of this debate, certainly action in the committee stage of this bill and hopefully then action outside of this chamber. Of course, there are a number of things that aren't here, and I do just want to mention two of those. One is there is not action on the issue of flammable cladding. And it has been 40 weeks now since the Building Commissioner turned up and put recommendations for action on the desk of the Minister about how to deal with that. There has been no action on that matter in those 40 weeks, no action from the government, no action from the Cabinet, and I simply don't understand why. I just do not understand why you could have recommendations from the Building Commissioner brought in to solve exactly this sort of problem and nothing has come out 40 weeks later. We don't have in New South Wales $600 million to help homeowners get on top of this problem. We don't have a standalone agency and we don't have the sort of coordination of risk or assessment that exists in Victoria. All of these things exist in Victoria. None of these things exist in New South Wales, and they should urgently. And this committee called on the government and the minister to release that advice. Release the advice from the building commissioner, and if the government disagrees with it, just say why. But it's inexplicable, unacceptable to have that advice sitting there and have no action, either positive or negative. Agree or disagree, put it out in public so that there can be some progress. And secondly, the second issue on which there's no action here is on historic defects. I won't dwell on this, but it's simply to say this, that the government's approach at the moment is if you have a problem in the past, well, largely you're on your own. And that is, well, I can just tell you from some of the stories we've heard, that is a very harsh message to some people whose lives have been massively impacted by this. On some of the specifics, there really are the two reports in this area, Lambert in New South Wales and Shorgolwee nationally, overlapping, very, very complementary. It really is, it was just overwhelmingly, it felt like a set of answers to this problem, to this crisis, in search of a government willing to ask the question, why don't we go and do this? That's just overwhelmingly what you were left with. We're getting some of the way there with these steps. We're certainly not all of the way there, and we should. We should be. I particularly want to commend Mr. Lambert, a former senior public servant, nothing to gain out of this process, and he has been diligent, fearless. He's just kept chipping away to put his genuine view about what should happen here. He has been very impressive. I commend him to the House. I commend his spirit of public service in this issue. He has been outstanding, and I did want to place that on the record. But, Deputy President, this has just been so slow. We debated here in this chamber, one of the last times we debated these issues was in the Building and Development Certifiers Act of 2018. We were told then it was urgent. That debate was raced through before Christmas. This was urgent action on the development crisis. We were all hands on deck. It was a good discussion here on these issues. Well, those regulations are still not in effect, not in action today as we debate this. They won't come into effect until the 1st of July this year. Well, so much for urgent action. So I urge the government, I urge the agency to act more swiftly in this next instance. The regulation of engineers, the fact we're taking serious steps towards that is very good. What became clear in the discussion was as Queensland and Victoria are really tightening up their registration, there is a real risk in New South Wales that we will have the wrong sort of characters moving into New South Wales in this space unless we act. And I recognise the fact that we will take significant steps on that today. And finally, I'll return to the point my colleague was making, the importance of a building commission. I think that is just fundamental here, but I won't dwell on that. I want to commend my colleagues, the Leader of the Opposition in this place and our Deputy Leader, Yasmin Catley, have both been heavily involved in this. And I want to recognise the committee, the chair of the committee and all the members, both government and non-government, for the work they've done, which has led to a much more sensible discussion. It is time to put the roulette wheel aside, though. That just ordinary people with taking the biggest gamble of their lives, going well for some, but going wrong for a whole lot more than you would think, is actually damaging every homeowner. Anyone who's investing in New South Wales in these classes of property, this significant period of time, is having their property value dragged down by the extent of this crisis. It's not just, there are some terrible stories out there, but this is having a systemic effect, a loss of confidence across construction that is bad for New South Wales, it's bad for our economy, and the sooner we get on top of it, the better.
Thank you, President. Honourable Rod Roberts, do you want the call? Okay. No.
I refer to the Honourable
The Honourable Robert Borzak.
Thank you, Mr.
Just I was giving him the call before.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. I rise on behalf of the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party to speak to this important bill before us. I too know, and we have experienced, lack of confidence in the building industry last year. This government brought a bill to the House last year in, I think it was, October, thereabouts. It was lacking quite a substantial amount. We had, obviously, our PAC inquiries. I think we got a lot of evidence there which Honourable John Graham spoke to, which teased out a lot of the issues, brought out in evidence from the Commissioner himself that he was probably a little bit at sixes and sevens. He didn't really understand what he could and what he couldn't do. He didn't know what the powers that he would have were. He didn't understand that the bill as it was being framed at that time really just didn't give him what he wanted. But on the other side of the coin, in my experience with what he's been working on since then, he's been doing an excellent job, and he's been drilling down, and he's been getting the support of the Minister and the people concerned. There are some shortcomings in relation to this bill, but I think the Minister and his staff have really worked very hard and very diligently to try and address that in the processes that they've worked on in the last few months, and I commend them for that. The bill was introduced last year, and there was an expectation at the time that the bill would be rushed through both houses of Parliament. This didn't happen because the Minister was prepared to listen, and that's what I was talking about a little bit earlier. I firstly would like to thank Minister Anderson, who's here with us tonight. I mean, he has listened, and he's been prepared to work collegiately with this House on all sides, and I commend you for that. And also, of course, his Chief of Staff, Gavin Melvin. I think he's sitting over there in the corner too. He's trying to hide. You guys actually have done a good thing for the state of New South Wales in the way that you've addressed this. This has been an excellent collegiate exercise. You can always do better, and there'll always be things that we could identify. But in the end of the day, it's a matter of confidence. If you want to come out of this COVID-19 situation that we're in now, if this government's talking about a recovery that's going to rely on development, you need confidence in the building industry. You need that confidence. And I know from my personal experience in the building industry and the businesses that I'm involved in, that the first half of this financial year, the second half of the last calendar year, we saw a significant lack of confidence coming through, especially in relation to new business being signed and actually business that we were winning or not winning in relation to the competitive nature of what was happening in the marketplace. You can't overestimate, or I should say perhaps you can't underestimate, the hits to confidence that the Mascot Towers revelations and the continuing revelations have done to the marketplace, and certainly Opal Towers and the front page disaster that the whole situation will be. There are literally hundreds of other smaller problems in Tier 2 and Tier 3 businesses and developments that just simply, of course, don't hit the papers. You don't see them on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is that New South Wales had degenerated, and that hopefully it will change now, had degenerated to the point where it's become the Wild West, with a lack of confidence and a lack of credibility developing within the building industry. So, as I said earlier, I commend the Minister and his staff for the work that they've done so far. It's not finished by all means. It's not often that you see a Minister in his government go to the lengths of consulting so widely about a bill. And honestly, he is a breath of fresh air for this Berejiklian government. I'm sure my colleagues in Labor and the Greens would agree if I pressed them hard enough. I've actually given you some compliments because that's what they've been saying to me behind your back.
That was just about his guitar.
I've given you away. This is one of the better bills that I've seen, and I know I sound unhappy about the collegiate nature of the way this is being done, but the government had to be forced to it. But in the end of the day, without too much forcing, they've actually seen the wisdom of what's being done. The building and property industry is a key economic driver of this state. We all know that. Decades of very poor regulation of the industry and inadequate enforcement powers to properly inspect and enforce building laws and Australian building standards has seen consumer confidence hit rock bottom, especially in the light of the revelations, as I mentioned earlier last year, regarding the Mascot Towers and Opal Towers. Because of this, we are now seeing thousands of buildings across the state with building defects, while many more thousands of residents have been left to fend for themselves. This bill marks an important step towards fixing some of these problems, but I don't believe it will be the last of what should be a complete overhaul of the industry. When someone purchases a property, they are not expecting to accrue an economic loss because of defects arising from the construction work relating to that property. And again, I'll echo what's happening, and it's still going on in relation to the Mascot Towers. I mean, it didn't take, I think it was in the papers last week, for example, that the latest bill for repairing that building is up to $59 million, and people are absolutely, completely bereft. They don't know where to go or what to do. It's not what you'd expect to have happen, and now we're talking about all sorts of legal actions. In the end of the day, no amount of legal action can stop or, make up for the quiet enjoyment of an investment, a life's investment you make in a residential property that you hope to enjoy. A duty of care is owed by persons who carry out that construction work. In what has been a long cross-party consultation process on this bill, which is indicative of the number of amendments that will be moved during the committee stage, I believe that for the first time in a very long time, we will have something that we can begin to reinstil confidence in the industry and the wider public. By no means is this the fix to all problems, but it is a start, and particularly with the suite of new obligations on design and building practitioners to ensure that each step of the construction process is well documented and ensures compliance. An issue close to my heart is the foundations business, which has only been driven by price and not quality. For over a decade, we have seen a substandard compliance with screw pile and sheet piling foundation systems. The lack of accountability and control in the installation has driven a culture of price-only competition and allowed shonks in the industry to flourish. Compliance to Australian building standards has been just an option, and we wish more Mascot Towers, and we risk more Mascot Towers and Opal Tower problems. There are literally hundreds of failures every year in buildings that simply don't see the light of day. Insurers have had to bear the brunt of these failures. Private certifiers cannot be the only people that should be scapegoated, or should have been scapegoated, I should say. The whole system has been corrupted. Non-compliance has become a way of life, and that must end. We need solid foundations if we are to build a solid economy and a building-led recovery out of our current COVID-19 problems. I will be moving a number of amendments that have been agreed to with the government, the opposition and the Greens, and I will have a little more to say during the committee stage. I commend the bill to the House.
Mr. President.
Honourable Rod Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise on behalf of One Nation to support the Design and Practitioners Bill. This bill is long overdue and should have been implemented some time ago. It is clear that the building industry needs a robust regulatory framework. Unfortunately, because of the relatively unchecked environment which builders and designers have recently operated, we have seen apartment building debacles such as Mascot and Opal Towers and many others that I won't go into here now. These incidents shatter confidence in the building and construction industry. This bill is aimed at restoring that confidence. This is an industry that contributes billions of dollars to the state economy and employs hundreds of thousands of workers. This is the same industry that we will be looking to drive us out of this post-COVID economy. And this will not happen without consumer confidence. Now, we all know real estate is expensive, and particularly here in Sydney. Apartments in Sydney run into the hundreds and millions of dollars. This is the life savings and 20 to 30 years of mortgages to people and families that we are talking about. Now, it's been stated many times before, but I will mention this analogy again, that you can buy a cheap toaster anywhere in New South Wales and obtain a better warranty than you previously could have on an apartment. This will now change with the introduction of this bill. This bill provides for the statutory duty of care to protect owners and owners' corporations. This bill will ensure that each step of the construction is well documented and compliant. It will place the onus on the relevant designers and builders to ensure that the building is safe and sound. So we congratulate the government on bringing this bill. And at this point in time, I also want to acknowledge the input of the opposition and also the other crossbenchers in making this and a number of amendments that they will make that will make this into a workable and acceptable piece of legislation. And we look forward to supporting these amendments. We also look forward to the complementary legislation that will come before this chamber on Thursday. Now, I've sat with Minister Anderson and I acknowledge his presence here in the House tonight and his Chief of Staff in particular, Gavin Melville, on a number of times. And their willingness to now work with and accept amendments to this bill should be acknowledged. Now, I may well be new to this chamber, Mr President, but I'm not new to life. And I understand that politics is involved. However, the people of New South Wales do not understand nor accept politics. What they want is answers and results. And I think that this is what they will be given out of this bill. And this is how a parliament should work. All sides coming together and contributing to an acceptable compromise to produce and pass legislation that will benefit those people of New South Wales. And for that reason, we'll be supporting this bill and its proposed amendments.
Thank you for that. Any further contributions from members? The Minister in reply.
Thank you, Mr Acting President. I just love the love. It's
COVID love.
I've been in this chamber a while. I've never heard a minister congratulated so much, and alone his chief of staff. And so I can't wait to bring a bill. I'm bringing one next week, or the week after. So I thank all the honourable members for their contribution, and I probably ought to say something in relation to the effectiveness of the committee stages in relation to eliciting proposals for inclusion in this bill. It's clear that not everyone has got everything that they want, and sometimes the best legislation or the best results often when everyone walks away and says, well, I would have liked more, but everyone by and large has walked out of here thinking that this is a much better improvement in relation to the building industry than currently existed before. And I endorse the remarks of Rod Roberts. I think sometimes life experience teaches you that that there are really important changes you've got to make, and people do expect politicians to work in the best interests of people to deliver results like this. So I know that there's going to be a lot of discussion in the committee stage of this bill about amendments which we're about to make to the bill, and I will reserve some of the comments which may be used in reply, because some of the issues raised by the Honourable Adam Searle in his speech in reply do call for some answer, but I think some of the answers may well have been answered in the committee stages of the bill. So I will conclude by thanking all those who've made a contribution, the Honourable Adam Searle, the Honourable David Shoebridge, the Honourable Courtney Hussos, the Honourable Fred Nile, and Reverend Nile did raise an issue that he does want, and does want addressed in relation to duty of care, and I am advised that in fact that will be addressed by an amendment which will be covered off, and I anticipate that the Leader of the Opposition will address that amendment in due course. I thank the Honourable John Graham and the Honourable Robert Borzak, and finally Rob Roberts. So the contribution is great, and I reiterate that we ought to stand here tonight passing this bill. Not quite yet, but certainly passing it at this stage with general agreement from all sides that it should be passed and that it does represent an improvement in the building industry. I personally have had a lot of experience in the building industry, and I've acted for numerous building clients and developer clients over a long period of time. And on both sides of it, in circumstances where people are complaining about defects, and on behalf of people who have built buildings which have been the subject of complaints about defects. And one thing I will say about both sides, each side is convinced that they are right, and it generally can become a lawyer's paradise. Hopefully this bill takes away a lot of the lawyer's paradise and just requires greater standards of care, duty of care, and obligations on parties to building contracts. And I do also want to put on record that we are enormously assisted by the Building Commissioner that the government has appointed. I think his experience and his cut through in relation to the Building Commission and I think so someone suggested that he was building an empire by stealth. It wouldn't surprise me. It's just that is the nature of Dave Chandler is that sort of cut-through person who can and demands outcomes in respect of the regime which he wants in place. So. A no-nonsense sort of guy, as the Honourable Trevor Cowan says. So I commend the bill to the House.
The motion is that this bill now be read a second time. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against say no. What a surprise. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clerk.
Design and Building Practitioners Bill, second reading.
Minister.
Thank you. Mr Acting President, I move that you do now leave the chair and the House to resolve itself into a committee of the whole to consider the bill in detail.
Motion is out of the Minister. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
No, that's all right.
White little down for you. So how we
disappointment. I was thinking.
Are you going first?
Well, I think we've got to all the amendments first.
Ours are first, of it.
Yeah, and then when we get mine, I'll move all of mine at once.
No, I don't need the cheat sheets. I'll put those down at the moment. What?
I might have to get out of here halfway through.
Yeah. No problem at all. Yeah. All right. The the Design and Building Practitioners Bill 2019 is leave granted to take the bill as a whole. Being no objection, I'll proceed accordingly. What I can indicate is that I have a large number of amendments, and I'm going to seek the assistance of members, particularly those at the table, as to how we are going to necessarily proceed, but I'll just indicate what I've got. We've got government amendments appearing on sheet C 2020-077A, opposition amendments appearing on sheet C 2020-079, quite a substantial number there. Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party amendments appearing on sheet C 2020-072. Greens amendments appearing on sheet C 2020-080. And finally, Greens amendments appearing on sheet C 2020-069B. Now, members are aware that there is a running sheet which starts with the government amendments. Now, I suspect, just from the chatter I hear from the floor, that there may be some amendments that are going to be moved, leave to move in globo. So I suppose we'll see how we go. Yeah.
For the assistance of the chair, I can indicate that all 31 amendments for the opposition on sheet 079, I will seek leave to move in globo, as they all relate to a single limited set of subject matter, the registration and the regulation of engineers and specialist practitioners.
Right.
Yes, Mr Deputy President, I can indicate that I will be moving in globo all the amendments contained on government sheet C 2020-077A.
Right.
Everybody's doing job lots.
Yeah, well, look, I'm not seeking to rush everyone, but as long as everyone has an understanding as to where we're going, because if they're going to be moved in globo, it's going to change the dynamics somewhat of the process. So, as we're going to start with the government amendments on that basis, I invite the Minister to...
Yes, thank you, Mr Deputy President. I seek leave to move government amendments contained on government sheet C 2020-077 capital A.
So that's amendments 1 to 7. Is leave granted to move 1 to 7 in globo?
Yep.
There being no objection, the member may proceed.
Yes, Mr Deputy President, I move amendments contained in sheets C 2020-077A, numbers 1 to 7 in globo. Mr Deputy President, these are a variety of amendments, and I'll just briefly mention what each of them are to ensure that the rationale behind the amendments is on Hansard. Amendment number 1, the commencement. The amendment seeks to provide definitive dates for the commencement of the bill rather than relying on dates to be proclaimed. The amendment will result in a staged approach to commencement. Firstly, the duty of care amendments will be commenced upon assent to provide immediate protections for consumers that are living in existing defective buildings. This is a sensible amendment and is consistent with the government's intention to commence these important protections without delay. The remaining framework providing for the registration of design and building practitioners and the making of declarations will commence on the 1st of July 2021. This ensures that these important reforms can be implemented as soon as possible while still allowing appropriate time for the supporting regulations to be developed and for necessary administrative processes to be established. This period will also ensure that industry has sufficient time to understand their new obligations so that they can become registered and comply with the new scheme. Amendment number 2 is a submission of registered designs, and amendments number 3 and 4 is notice of application for occupation certificate. The amendments introduce a further obligation on the building practitioner for the lodgement of designs and other critical documents. Building practitioners will need to ensure that all relevant documents are provided to the Secretary no later than 90 days after the occupation certificate is issued for the building. Relevant documents mean each regulated design that reflects the building work that was carried out and any other documents or designs prescribed by the regulations. The lodgement of these documents will be critical in establishing whether the building was built in accordance with the designs. This requirement will also serve to ensure that the Secretary has a complete set of documentation which reflects how the building was actually built. Non-compliance would result in significant penalties of up to $33,000 for bodies corporate and $11,000 in any other case. Amendments number 3 to 4 are necessary to ensure that the building practitioner can meet this new obligation. The amendments require the person who makes an application for an occupation certificate to notify each building practitioner of the application. This ensures that the building practitioner has adequate time to arrange for all relevant documents to be provided within the 90-day period. The other amendments are drafting errors in many respects. Amendment number 5 is a correction to the clause heading. This amendment corrects the drafting error. Amendment number 6, dealing with false representation. This is again a drafting improvement just to make the drafting more succinct. And finally, amendment number 7, the powers of authorised officers, and this amendment again merely corrects the drafting error. I commend the amendments to the House.
Chair. The opposition will be supporting each of those amendments for the reasons that the government has outlined. We certainly think these are, in combination with the other amendments, lift the quality of the legislation somewhat.
Mr Shoebridge.
Mr Chair, the Greens support these government amendments. One of the key issues we had was ensuring this legislation actually starts. And as I think the Honourable John Graham noted, there's been legislation passed by this House in the relevant portfolio area with this agency, which still hasn't commenced, even though we were told it was critical some 2 years ago. So getting the dates for commencement clearly written here in black and white is critical for us having giving support to getting the bill through. And the document and the provisions in relation to the requirement to produce documents and ensure that the documents are retained in a form where the final owners can actually get the plans and identify what their building that they live in looks like is critical. We heard time and time again in the course of the inquiries about building owners wanting to just understand what their building, what the building designs for their building were. They were told either the plans didn't exist, they were in a shoebox somewhere, some of them were in a shoebox, some of them were lost. These are important reforms, and that's why we support these amendments.
Honourable Robert Borzak.
Thanks, Mr Deputy President. The Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party associate themselves with these amendments, and like the Labor Party and the Greens, will be supporting them.
The Leader of the Government has moved government amendments 1 to 7 appearing on sheet C 2020-077A. The question is the amendments be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Now, just before we move on to the next amendments, which clearly are to be the opposition amendments, I'm aware that the Honourable Robert Borsak might not be able to be here all night.
Not going to be very long.
Will you be long?
We're not going to be long. No.
We're not going to be long. It doesn't seem that there's any conflict, but I'm just wondering if...
You want to do mine now?
Well, that's what I'm sort of inviting. If
I'm happy to do it that way.
The Honourable Robert Borsak.
Thank you.
Sorry, this is unusual, but it seems to be that there's a good deal of kumbaya.
We're always happy to accommodate you.
Yeah.
They're happy to see you go.
I need some gun control amendments done. Can you do this?
Well, that's what we're going to do when
The amber's not that wide.
That's what we'll do when
Let's work on the kumbaya.
All right. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. My amendments. Where are we? Mr. Chair, I seek leave to move amendments 1 and 2 appearing on sheet 2020-072 in Globo.
You just want to do 1 and 2 at this stage?
Sorry?
we want to do them all.
Well, I've got a little bit of separate words to say on each one.
Fine.
Some are in Globo, some are not.
That's fine.
Is leave granted?
Yep.
Leave is granted.
Thank you. These amendments simply clarify that references to preparing or varying a design in the bill extend to coordinating or supervising the work as well as actually doing the work. This will ensure appropriate accountability for design practitioners. That's all I've got to say.
You don't want to say that?
Well, I just indicate that the government will be supporting the amendment.
I assume so.
The opposition will be supporting the amendments.
Mr Shoebridge.
Yeah, the Greens support the amendments. We're glad to see them brought.
The Honourable Robert Borsak has moved amendments numbers 1 and 2 appearing on sheet C 2020-072. The question is the amendments be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The Honourable Robert Borsak.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Chair, I move amendment number 3 appearing in sheet 2020-003T. Mr Chair, this amendment will ensure that there is a head of power for the regulations to prescribe specific details about the form and content of regulated designs. In the consultation with stakeholders, they have suggested that it may be useful to prescribe details such as the appropriate scale of a design to be mandated for certain designs or regulated hold points. The amendment will also allow the Minister, by order published in the Gazette, to specify particulars additional to those prescribed in the regulation. This will provide the required flexibility to respond to changes in compliance requirements to the Building Code of Australia. In addition, it will also allow for greater guidance to be given to industry about specific types of designs that are captured. For example, the regulations could prescribe architectural designs for floor plans as a class of regulated design. The order could also seek to prescribe subcategories of designs for floor plans, specifying that a floor plan must contain a design for wet fire services, potable water supply tanks and pumps and electricity supply. That's it.
No one seeks the call. Sorry.
Can I just clarify the amendment, the sheet that it is...
072, I think.
2, I thought it was, not T.
072.
I've got... Well, it's all on 072. I don't know what this other stuff is. Sorry, I beg your pardon. It is all on 072.
Yeah.
I don't know where 003T comes from.
on 072, and on that basis, the government will be supporting the amendment.
We almost got that on 1 through.
The opposition will also be supporting these amendments.
Nearly got your gun control.
Nearly got it done, yeah.
The Honourable Robert Borsak has moved amendment number 3 on sheet C 2020-072. The question is the amendment be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The Honourable Robert Borsak.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Chair. Mr Chair, I seek to move amendments 4 and 6 appearing on sheet 2020-072, got it right, this time in Globo. Mr Chair, these amendments aim to further classify...
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Sorry.
Just clarify again, is it 4, 5 and 6 or just...
No, this is just 4 and 6,
Okay.
and 5 will come separately.
Okay, thank you.
Mr Chair, these amendments aim to further clarify the meaning of the building element under the bill. The significance of the term arises from the fact that designs prepared for a building element are automatically deemed to be a regulated design. Accordingly, those designs must be prepared by certain qualified designers who will be required to declare compliance with the Building Code of Australia. Amendment 4 clarifies that the fire safety systems within the meaning of the Building Code of Australia are a building element, which negates the need to add further clarity through the regulations. Amendment 6 clarifies that those fire safety aspects of the mechanical, plumbing and electrical services for a building that are required to achieve compliance with the Building Code of Australia are building elements. This negates the need for any further clarifying building services through the regulations. That's it.
Mr David Shoebridge.
The Greens support these amendments and appreciate the shooters, fishers and farmers for bringing them. This is an aspect where there was substantial input from stakeholders. The initial bill as drafted would have seen large and essential features of particularly modern residential flat buildings unregulated, that being the mechanical, plumbing and electrical services in the building. And as we know, and we heard repeatedly from stakeholders, that can be where there are very expensive defects, that can be where there is significant concerns to the health and safety of people who live in apartment buildings. And to be quite frank, the initial proposal that it might all get sorted out sooner or later in the regulations was unsatisfactory to them. And we understood why it was unsatisfactory. So we had a series of amendments that were seeking to do these same things. But we appreciate them being brought by the shooters, fishers and farmers, and we'll be supporting them.
Oh, look at the lovely. The Minister. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, the opposition will also be supporting them for the same reasons.
Thank you. Sorry, Minister.
So that's okay. Thank you, Mr Deputy President. The government will be also supporting the amendments.
The Honourable Robert Borzak has moved shooters, fishers and farmers amendments 4 and 6 appearing on sheet C 2020-072. The question is the amendments be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The Honourable Robert Borzak.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I move amendment number 5 appearing on sheet 2020-072. I got this 0032 for suddenly appeared. Mr Chair, this amendment aims to further clarify the meaning of building element under the bill. The amendment clarifies that in-ground foundations are an example of an internal and external load-bearing component of the building, putting beyond any doubt that piling is a building element.
The Minister.
The government will be supporting the amendment, Mr Deputy President.
The Honourable Adam Searle.
Mr Chair, the opposition will also be supporting the amendment.
Mr David Shoebridge.
Yeah. The Honourable Robert Borzak knows a little bit about foundations, having brought some experience to the table, and he's persuaded us that this is not only sensible but it's essential, and we'll support it.
Thank you.
The Honourable Robert Borzak has moved amendment number 5 appearing on sheet C 2020-072. The question is the amendment be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The Honourable Robert Borzak.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Deputy President, I seek leave to move amendments 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 appearing on sheet 2020-072 in globo.
So that's the...
Thank you.
That's the balance. Leave is granted.
That's the balance of them, yeah. These are all minor amendments that remove any doubt that a design practitioner only needs to provide a declaration in circumstances when they provide a person with a regulated design that has been prepared or varied by them.
And just to be precise, you move those.
I move those amendments.
The Minister?
The government will be supporting those amendments.
The Honourable Adam Searle.
The opposition will also be supporting these amendments. They provide important clarifications to the scope of the legislation, and we welcome them.
Mr David Shoebridge.
Yes, the Greens will be supporting these amendments. The architects in particular wanted this clarification, and I think they deserve it, and they made a compelling case, which is why we support the amendments.
Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile.
The Christian Democratic Party supports these amendments.
Excellent. The Honourable Robert Borzak has moved shooters, fishers and farmers party amendments 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 appearing on sheet C 2020-072. The question is the amendments be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you. We now move on. Thanks, Rob. We now move on to opposition amendments appearing on sheet C 2020-079. The Honourable Adam Searle.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I seek leave of the Committee of the Whole to move opposition amendments on sheet C 2020-079, and that is amendments 1 through to 31 in globo.
Wow. Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I thank the House for its consideration, and I will make some remarks that address each of them individually as well as collectively. And I think it's worth reflecting that on the last occasion when we were discussing this legislation mid to late November of last year, the second reading contribution I gave addressed a substantially different circumstance. I won't labour the history. It's a matter of record that the bill that came to this chamber in the view of stakeholders, including consumers as well as professional bodies and most of the parties represented in this place, was moving in the right direction, but lacked a lot of the gravitas that was required if we were really to rebuild confidence in the building and construction industry in the wake of some of the defect scandals that we had seen unfolding. And the bill that was brought here had those defects, no pun intended, and of course there was significant disagreement between the governing parties, crossbench parties and the opposition.
We said they were
about
structural, they said they were cosmetic.
Yeah, well, I acknowledge that interjection. But the point was we had significant disagreements, and those disagreements for a long time led to, as it were, a deadlock where the legislation was not progressing through the Parliament because the government was fearful of the amendments that this place may carry, and of course there was concern on the part of stakeholders that they might be left with nothing rather than something imperfect. And of course it's a matter of record that the Public Accountability Committee of this House has also significantly considered issues to do with the building and construction industry and has delivered a number of reports. And all of these processes have gone hand in glove with discussion between the parties, with stakeholders over a very significant period of time, dealing with very complex issues. And the result is the unfolding series of amendments that are being discussed here tonight. Now, we commend all of these amendments to the House. It is a compromise position. It's not necessarily what any one party or group would have wanted. In terms of the amendments that I've just moved in globo, they all deal with the registration and the regulation of engineers and specialist practitioners covered by the bill. Labor's preferred approach would have been a separate piece of legislation for the registration of professional engineers. And that was in fact our policy, and in fact a bill to that effect was introduced into the other place by Labor's Deputy Leader, Yasmin Catley MP, who is also the Shadow Minister for Building Reform. However, we are pleased that we've come to this point of agreement, and we will be able to see the registration of professional engineers occur as a result of the legislation passing this House. It aligns with community expectations. It aligns to a much greater degree than the existing bill with other states and jurisdictions, and it helps industry and government ensure that there are appropriate checks and balances in engineering work. Checks and balances for engineers, like a registration scheme, will assist in hopefully making sure that events such as those involving the Opal Towers or Mascot Towers do not happen again from the point at which these provisions become law. It will also mean that our bridges, roads, electricity networks, water facilities also have registered and recognised professional engineers working on those projects. Of course, it was a matter of astonishment to me when the idea of a registration scheme for engineers was raised with me over a lunch in Melbourne by the former National Director of Professionals Australia, Chris Walton. The idea, I said, you're having a lend, aren't you? I mean, surely these characters have to be registered now. I mean, you've got to be registered if you're an architect, a nurse or a midwife, a vet, doctor, a lawyer. The idea that someone could be an engineer but not be registered was truly not just astonishing, but frankly alarming. And so we are here today. The amendments that we put before the House are the result of Labor's extensive network with stakeholders in the industry, and was a commitment that we did make to the sector at the last state election. And I thank Yasmin Catley for the work that she's done on this since the election, and without which work I don't think we would have got to this stage. But I also want to recognise the work of my colleague in this chamber, the Honourable Peter Primrose MLC, who, when the Shadow Minister for Local Government, actually caused our party to adopt the proposal of a registration scheme for professional engineers, largely arising from the local government sector, but not limited to that. Now, it's also worth noting, as a matter of historical interest, that the government parties, the Liberals and Nationals, themselves also made a commitment to an engineering registration scheme at the 2019 election. Matt Keane, the former Minister for Better Regulation, said in his media release on Friday, 22 February 2019, that, and I quote, "the biggest recommendation in the Opal Tower report was about registering engineers," unquote. And then he says further, and I quote again, "and we've already agreed to that," unquote. Now, again, there was some difficulty post-election in holding the government to that electoral commitment. I won't go through the history, but now we are here with a lot of hard work, serious negotiation, and frankly some difficult moments, but we are now here, and so we think this is a very important moment in time. Mr. President, we rely on engineers to ensure that our buildings are safe, that our bridges will carry heavy loads, and to ensure public infrastructure stands the test of time, like tunnels, roads, and government buildings, of course, like schools and hospitals. And noting the government's fast tracking of proposals in the planning system as one of the ways to deal with the pandemic economic slump, we want to make sure that if we're pumping a significant amount of public money into public infrastructure, that it actually stands the test of time and doesn't fall down. So we believe these amendments will go a long way to ensuring we have quality engineering work in our communities. I'll now deal with the amendments in some more detail. Amendments 1 to 7 make minor amendments to the language in the bill to encompass the range of practitioners who are covered by the bill, including professional engineers, building and design practitioners. Amendments 8 and 9 address the responsibility of the building practitioner and ensure that the registered design practitioner is given or has access to the regulated designs and design compliance declarations. This ensures that building practitioners will have to take reasonable steps to ensure that the registered design practitioners must have access to additional declarations and any relevant designs and declarations. Amendment 10 makes it clear that design variations must not be considered in isolation, but must also consider the effect of their variation on other aspects of the building work or the regulated designs for the building work, which means that there will be a holistic approach. That is, you'll be looking at the change in the context of the whole. And that's, I think, a significant mindset change in this legislation which will occur as a result of these amendments. Amendment 11 relates to the recognition of professional engineering work, defining professional engineering work, mandating that a person must not carry out professional engineering work in a prescribed area of engineering unless that person is a registered engineer, and the person's registration authorises the person to carry out the professional engineering work, or they are directly supervised by a registered engineer, or they are authorised to carry out the work in the regulations. The amendment also prescribes areas of engineering in the bill, including structural engineering, civil, mechanical, fire safety, electrical engineering, or an area of engineering prescribed by the regulations. And that's an important facilitative provision to ensure that although we think we've covered the gamut, there may be occasions when that needs to be improved upon, and the Minister and the Government will have the power to so do. This will mean engineers that work on important structures like bridges and roads will be covered by the legislation, which we believe isn't particularly responsible given, again, the Government wants to use so-called shovel-ready projects as a key economic stimulus measure in the wake of COVID-19. The section also outlines the indemnity requirements for professional engineers. Engineers must be adequately insured either individually or through other means as outlined in the regulation, for example through their employers' group policy. The next, the amendments 12 to 14 make amendments to the requirements for registration, the registration of engineers and specialist practitioners, and the conditions of of registration for registered practitioners. Amendment 15 states that the regulations may impose a condition of registration, specifically to ensure that practitioners maintain ongoing registration or recognition with a professional body if so required. And Mr Chair, if I might just pause there, that is not an unknown provision relating to currently registered professions, the requirement that you have ongoing professional development, and particularly given the vital work undertaken by engineers and the need for their work to stand up through the test of time, we think this is another important development. Amendment 16 outlines the requirements for recognition, including that registered practitioners must hold designated qualifications, or if they are registered by a professional body, or are registered in another state. This means we can recognise engineers who have already been through a stringent process, for example, in Queensland, and not require that professional engineer to repeat the process. Amendment 17 relates to the recognition of professional bodies for engineers. Where a professional body undertakes a recognition process with an engineer, this amendment will ensure that those professional bodies are held to standards similar to Queensland and Victoria. And hopefully we will achieve essentially a common set of requirements across the whole of the eastern seaboard, which I know the Minister, who's present in the gallery, values very highly as a good public policy outcome, as do we, and we think that sentiment would be shared widely in the community. The Secretary in this instance will be able to recognise professional bodies they see fit to conduct this recognition of professional engineers. These bodies may only be recognised if they meet the following criteria. A, the professional body's recognition or registration scheme, Roman numeral 1, adequately provides for the assessment of qualifications and competencies of professional engineers in an area of engineering, and Roman 2 is consistent with national and international standards for the recognition of professional engineers, and Roman 3 has fees that are reasonable having regard to the scope of the services being offered, and Roman 4 includes adequate continuing professional development requirements for professional engineers and an effective audit program to ensure continuing registration requirements are met, and Roman 5 meets the requirements, if any, prescribed by regulations, and B, the professional body has Roman 1, adequate procedures for monitoring and improving the assessment process carried out under the scheme, Roman 2, the financial capacity and facilities to conduct assessments of qualifications and competencies, and Roman 3, a proven capacity to undertake independent and authoritative assessments in a timely manner. These provisions will give the community, hopefully, full confidence that bodies assessing engineers will be robust, will ensure that proper competencies are reached and that they are consistent with national and indeed international standards. This is vitally important if we are to restore the shattered confidence of consumers in this state. The remaining amendments make minor changes to the drafting of the bill or to align the requirements of professional engineers with other practitioners in the bill. The amendments Labor moves today will achieve a number of outcomes, hopefully. Ensuring engineers and specialist practitioners are registered, that the regulations can prescribe that engineers or practitioners must maintain their assessment or recognition with a professional body to maintain that registration. For example, if an engineer does an assessment with a professional body and undertakes the relevant assessment of competency and qualifications, that they may be required to maintain an ongoing assessment to stay registered, and ensuring that the bodies that assess engineers for registration must adhere to a strict set of competencies themselves, as in Queensland and Victoria, to underpin a renewed, strong consumer confidence in the profession and the profession's work. The responsibility of the building practitioner will impose additional obligations on the building practitioner who does building work to take all reasonable steps to ensure that the registered design practitioner has access to any regulated design compliance declaration or principal design compliance declaration, if any, considered by the practitioner in the endorsement of the design to which the declaration relates, as of course defined in the regulations, and imposes on the building practitioner who does the building work to take all reasonable steps to ensure that where a variation occurs to an existing or new building element or performance solution after building work has commenced, the design practitioner must prepare an additional declaration. Who prepared an additional declaration must have access to, as defined in the regulations, any relevant design or declaration. Compliance with the Building Code of Australia, holistic consideration which ensures changes to designs must be endorsed and declared in consideration of compliance with the entire development, not just with one variation. Mr. Chair, most importantly, these amendments will hopefully transform the bill into what the industry requires to restore consumer confidence in the building and construction sector. The three major industry stakeholders, Professionals Australia, Engineers Australia and the Institute of Public Works Engineers, have repeatedly called on government to provide their sector with a robust scheme of registration to ensure unqualified engineers are not practising in our state.
Order. Time has expired, but Mr Shoebridge, do you want to make a very brief contribution? Because it may then be that the Honourable Adam Searle wishes to make another contribution.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I'll just pause there.
Do you make a contribution?
Chair.
Yeah.
Mr Chair, on behalf of the Greens, I wish to indicate our strong support for these opposition amendments, all 31 of them on sheet 2020-079. Mr Chair, with these amendments, and not without some initial quite significant resistance from the government, which I'm glad to say has worn down over time, I think partly because of the fact that the numbers didn't change. Just the numbers were not changing on this. We saw between the opposition, the Greens, Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party and the Animal Justice Party, a pretty clear statement that we weren't going to allow this bill to pass this chamber without some clear and workable form for registering engineers. And it didn't matter how many different approaches the government took, we all stuck to that. And we all stuck to that because I think we'd all been approached by some of the most competent and capable people you can imagine, who all have a lot of skin in the game, who happen to be engineers. And I really commend the work of Professionals Australia. I commend the work of Engineers Australia, and I commend the work of the Institute of Public Works Engineers Australia, because each of them have come to us with their own disparate specialities and said to us, we can't allow New South Wales to become the last refuge of the scoundrel. If we have increasingly effective registration schemes in Queensland and Victoria and no registration scheme in New South Wales, we are going to have not just our current problems in terms of regulating building design, we are going to have increasing problems where those people who get spat out of the system in Queensland or Victoria just simply trot across the border and start practising substandard engineering in New South Wales. So,
Could I just interrupt for one moment?
Yes.
It being 10 p.m, proceedings are now interrupted to permit the Minister to move the adjournment motion if desired. No. Mr Shoebridge. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And so I commend them for their work. And in fact, I think I was with the Honourable Adam Searle when we were speaking at an event for the Institute of Public Works Engineers Australia in the end of 2018, where we both gave a commitment to do everything we could to put in place, on behalf of our respective parties, the Greens and the Opposition, put in place legislation that would see the registration of engineers. So it's nice to see that commitment coming to fruit. Pity Mount Keen wasn't at the event. Yes, that's good to see that commitment coming good. It actually is good, and I will say this: it's good to see that I think the government has acknowledged the merits of that unified position from all of those key stakeholders. They've stuck to their position, and I do think the Minister has listened. I hope he's on board with this. I think he's on board with these where we are now, the position that we have, and we will finally get the registration of engineers in New South Wales. Look, I will also commend the work of the Shadow Minister. She's been a champion from the outset, and she pulled together that bill, which then found its way into the first sheet of amends, she has been collaborative to work with, and has brought forward, I think, her office, together with the support, I think, from those other members in the crossbench, we have finally brought together a set of amends which will finally get the registration of engineers. So I commend the amendments to the House.
I think I'll call again on the Honourable Adam Searle.
Thank you.
He hasn't quite finished, Fred, and then I'll call on you.
Not quite. Thank you, Mr Chair. I would also like to thank Professionals Australia, in particular Mr Gordon Brock, who's here in the President's Gallery, for their assistance in developing the amendments that the opposition puts forward. We know how deeply your organisation and your members care about the registration of engineers and how they want a robust and effective scheme here in New South Wales to ensure that their work is held to the highest of standards. Also, thanks to Engineers Australia and the Institute of Public Works Engineers for their ongoing engagement on this important topic. Stakeholders in the community want this robust registration model set out in legislation to ensure their profession continues to be trusted and provides quality engineering services to our community. I won't labour the need for it, but Engineers Australia said in a press release last year, and I quote, "It is unacceptable that virtually anyone in New South Wales will still be able to call themselves an engineer, even if they have no relevant education or experience and no commitment to maintain competency. This contrasts with other professionals like architects, doctors and lawyers, who all must be registered before legally providing services. Without regulation of professional engineers, public confidence will remain broken, leaving innocent people and the economy as victims, quote unquote," and never was a truer word spoken. This check and balance is absolutely paramount, and we know other jurisdictions have recognised this. Queensland has a long-standing professional engineers registration scheme, and of course the Victorian Parliament in 2019 enacted the Professional Engineers Registration Act. And the Victorian Labor government said about its scheme that, and I quote, "The comprehensive scheme recognises the pivotal role engineers have in ensuring public safety in a wide range of areas, including complex infrastructure projects and promoting continuing professional development for practitioners," unquote. Mr Chair, what we're really happy to see here is not just that this is a political commitment made by one political party or a number of political parties, but that hopefully every member and every party in this place has come together in support of this idea whose time has well and truly come. And that hopefully will make this reform a lasting one. And if it is found defective or wanting, there will be an ongoing political commitment to maintain and improve it. There is that consensus I can feel in this chamber tonight for moving forward in this respect, which is why we've been able to bring these amendments to the floor, not just with a majority support, which we think existed from the beginning, but unanimous support, including, importantly, on the part of the government of the day, which now must implement this scheme. Consumers, everyday folk buying houses, using public transport, driving on newly constructed roads, working in a new commercial office building or buying a new apartment are in favour of it, and they can have confidence in the resulting work. And as the Leader of the Government opined across the table not too many minutes ago, even the former Minister for Better Regulation, Matt Keane, is in favour of it. So we commend all of these amendments to the House. We thank all of the other parties here and the government for their support. Let's get this done.
Reverend Nile.
I want to take 1 minute to say that the Christian Democratic Party is pleased to see the progress that's been made, and that Engineers Australia are very happy with this whole registration system. I think it's a great improvement, and we thank everyone who's helped to bring it about.
Thank you, Reverend Nile. The Leader of the Government.
Yes, thank you. The government supports the amendments which have been made, and I echo the sentiment of the Leader of the Opposition that the way that this bill has now come together, in many respects, is almost a reflection of the process which potentially should have adopted about leaving the bill on a table for a period of time for everyone to mull over. Alternatively, I think, as the Honourable Mark Latham is suggesting, having white papers about these sort of proposals so that they, I suppose, ferment in
a long way from a white paper.
Ferment in the pot of opinion and getting the best possible outcome. And the Minister is in the chamber. In terms of the sentiment expressed by the Leader of the Opposition, I know he's on board with all these amendments. He wants to see them work. He wants to see them work in the context of this Act, because we're talking about tonight here about a Design on Building and Construction Act, and the relevance of engineers in this process is so important to making sure the documentation and the certificates are provided by people who have the appropriate qualifications and who are registered. In many respects, it lacks authenticity if in fact certificates are being given by people without qualifications and, dare I say, without proper training or ongoing professional development. So all the things that the opposition has outlined in relation to these amendments are common sense provisions for the purposes of registration of engineers. I note that the former Minister for Better Regulation was absolutely committed to this regime, as he gave us a commitment pre the 2019 election. But we are here today in June of 2020, and we have achieved this. And I think the Minister and all the parties who have had some input into this registration scheme ought to be congratulated, because it is an important and worthwhile amendment to the general scheme of the design and construction and the protection of consumers in relation to the building industry.
The Honourable Adam Searle has moved opposition amendments 1 to 31 appearing on sheet C 2020-079. The question is the amendments be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We'll now move on to...
Next.
Almost there. The Greens amendments.
Up to you.
Mr David Shoebridge.
Takes two to tango out.
Well, we're pretty light on our feet tonight.
Mr Chair, I move, I seek the Leader of the House to move
Given.
amendments numbers 1 to 10 on sheet 2020-080 together.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
I move those amendments. Mr Chair, these amendments all relate to the re-establishing of what I think all practitioners, I'm pretty certain all legal practitioners and much of the industry thought was the way in which the duty of care operated in the construction industry. It's seeking to re-establish what everyone thought was the common law position prior to the High Court case of Brookfield Multiplex and the Owners Corporation of Strata Plan 61288 in 2014 in the High Court of Australia. And these concerns had been raised repeatedly by stakeholders in the course of the Public Accountability Committee's inquiry into the regulation of building standards, building quality and building disputes. We saw repeated representations from the likes of the Owners Corporation network. I've had multiple different lawyers in the area contact me about the defects in the law in relation to defects in New South Wales. And these amendments taken together will seek to re-establish what everybody thought was the common law prior to that High Court case. I think it's probably necessary to briefly just indicate what the problem was created by the multiplex decision. And in this regard, I'm grateful for a workable summary from Mackinson. Oh, I've got that entirely wrong. Mackinson and Dappergy, thank you. Mackinson and Dappergy, which they actually, their case note that they brought out soon after the High Court case in 2014. And so on the 8th of October 2014, the High Court of Australia delivered its long-awaited decision in Brookfield Multiplex and the Owners Corporation of Strata Plan 61288. In doing so, the High Court ruled on the question as to whether a builder of a strata-titled serviced apartment complex owed an Owners Corporation a duty of care to avoid causing the Owners Corporation economic loss of the cost of repairing latent defects in the property. The High Court overturned the decision of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, which had found in favour of the Owners Corporation. There were 4 separate judgments written by the 7 judges who heard the case, and while there were variations in the 4 judgments, the Court unanimously decided that the builder did not owe the Owners Corporation, in this case, a duty of care. This meant that the Owners Corporation's claim against the builder to recover compensation for the cost of rectifying the defects failed. I won't go into further detail about the case. And as I said, there were 4 separate judgments that you really have to read together to get the ratio of the decision. But it effectively said that the duty of care stops with the first purchaser and doesn't flow on after that. Other than in extreme circumstances where there was you could prove some vulnerability and the like, but effectively killed the duty of care at that point. And as the lawyers said in their summary about the case, pointing out the enormous problems that was going to cause in the construction industry, and particularly for poor old homeowners who, having purchased a property and then finds a latent defect, realising that they would have no claim against the builder because they had no duty of, because the builder under the High Court case owed them no duty of care. At the end of 2014, the lawyer says this: "Where to from here? The need for legislative reform in this area has never been more important. In circumstances where the individual owners in Chelsea Apartments were faced with, first, a standard form contract that would not have been susceptible of any amendment by them, and second, the abrogation of their rights to vote by the terms of the leases of their lots in Park Hotel, it's difficult to imagine a scenario in which purchasers of lots in commercial developments will ever have the requisite vulnerability to establish a duty of care by the builder to those owners. As a result, commercial strata schemes will have almost no legal protection from shoddy building work in the construction of their building." I mean, indeed, Multiplex, that decision has had that effect, killed the duty of care, and seen many defects claims failing, not because they can't prove that there was shoddy building work, not because they can't prove who did the shoddy building work, but simply because the law says the duty of care doesn't flow through to subsequent purchases. So what these amendments taken together do is they effectively, by legislation, repeal that High Court case. I'll briefly run through the various amendments. Amendment number 1 provides that the duty of care applies to all building, puts the definition of building for the purpose of the duty of care, and has the broad meaning of building in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. Amendment number 2 makes it clear that the duty of care extends to building work, including residential building work within the meaning of the Home Building Act, so ensuring that the duty of care amendments have broad coverage, which is the intent. Amendment number 3 extends the duty of care to include, extends the definition of construction work for the purpose of this duty of care to include supervising, coordinating, project managing, or otherwise having substantive control over the carrying out of any work. Amendment number 4, importantly, expands the duty of care. As originally drafted by the government, the duty of care would only apply to individuals, that is, natural persons. As we know, many people, not only do we want owners' corporations, which are not natural persons, to benefit from the duty of care, but many people, for example, in their superannuation, if they are purchasing a property, would purchase it through a corporate trustee, and we would want to ensure that the duty of care extends beyond just individuals, and that's why the amendment omits individual and inserts instead person, and person at law has a broad definition, including legal persons such as corporations and owners' corporations and the like. Amendment number 5 addresses some minor changes to the definition of owner. Amendment number 6 expands the duty of care to include provisions under the Strata Scheme Management Act and the Community Land Management Act. Amendment number 7 also is important insofar as it provides that the duty of care is owed to an owner whether or not the construction work was carried out under a contract or other arrangement entered into with the owner or another person, or otherwise than under a contract or arrangement, ensuring there are no legal loopholes that can be exploited by builders to avoid liability. Amendment number 8 makes it clear that the economic costs suffered by an owner's corporation, where it's proven, can also include the reasonable costs of providing alternative accommodation where that's been necessary. And we don't have to look beyond the Mascot Towers to realise how important that can be, and how, if you don't have that as part of the economic loss, we can see homeowners at enormous financial peril while they're literally paying a mortgage for one place and paying rent on another. Amendment number 9 has some consequential amendments, and amendment number 10 deals with importantly the retrospective application of the duty of care. Why do we insist upon it being retrospective? Well, the reason we insist upon it being retrospective is we are trying to cure a defect in the law that has been on the statute, which has been on the books since that High Court decision at the end of 2014. There has been a lot of discussion about the nature of the retrospectivity. I think all of us are anxious about making retrospective application of law, but I think all of us agree as a matter of principle that the law has been misfiring for the last 6 years. Valid, legitimate claims have not been able to be run, and homeowners have been left without a legal remedy. And that's why the retrospectivity of amendment contained in amendment number 10 has it going back 10 years. So it provides that the economic loss caused by a breach of duty of care is extended under that subclause if the loss first became apparent within the 10 years immediately before the commencement of the relevant section, section 31. So that will allow it to go back to the multiplex period, to that decision in multiplex, and cover that period, but also 4 years before that, because there will have been multiple people who will have gone to their lawyers in 2015 and 2016 and said, what about our case? Do you think we should be able to have a case? And they will have been told, I'm sorry, this multiplex case defeats your claim. And if we'd only gone back 6 years to the multiplex decision, we would not have been providing a remedy for those people. There has been some negotiation back and forth between the government and my office on that. We originally wanted a broader leave application, but I do think we've probably got it right there with that 10-year retrospectivity. The other important aspect that I will say about the application of it, the initial draft from the government excluded the retrospective operation of these duty of care provisions to any matter which was already before the courts. So if some homeowner had actually brought a case, acted promptly, brought the case, was arguing the case, on the government's initial draft, they would have been excluded from the benefit of the retrospectivity. That seemed to me to be punishing people who are acting with due diligence, albeit no doubt in a difficult case, but seeking to recover as best they could. What this amendment does, and I'll read it onto the record in subsection 3, it provides that Part 3 of the Act, which is the relevant provisions in relation to duty of care, as extended by subclause 1, applies regardless of whether an action for breach of a common law duty of care has commenced before the commencement of section 31 and may be taken into account in those proceedings unless the court considers that it would not be in the interests of justice to do so. And the reason we include that provision is this. I can think of many, many cases where it would be entirely appropriate that the amendments be, if necessary, the pleadings can be amended, or the law as amended can apply to the pleadings and the case as brought before the court. But there may be cases where they have effectively concluded. Everything's finished. The experts have been done, the judgment's happened, and there's maybe only an outstanding matter on costs or some minor outstanding provision. And it may be in those circumstances the court says, well, I don't think the interests of justice are satisfied here. This case is done and dusted, it's finished. And rather than us try and draw the line by legislation, we thought it was appropriate, and I appreciate the negotiations and discussions with the Minister's office, that the appropriate thing was to allow the court to draw the line and using that test of what would be in the interests of justice to do so. So it's for those reasons we move that suite of amendments. And we do hope that by doing that, we provide a real remedy for homeowners. Of course, our key intent with all of this is to stop us getting there, stop us getting to the point where legal cases are brought. But there's a huge backlog of defects for which a legal remedy is necessary. And not only that, even with the best regulation in the world, there will be a need to provide an adequate legal remedy for homeowners to recover against defects in the future, and we think this does that.
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chair. The government will be supporting the amendments. I can appreciate the complexity of the arguments which have been put and the significant discussion which must have occurred in relation to retrospectivity. Landing that, I think, just in itself is a significant achievement. I must say that before Brookfield, I would have been of the view, if I'd been giving advice in relation to this, the duty of care did in fact flow, and I think it would have been the common understanding that if you design a building, for example, and there's a defect in that design, or alternatively there's a defect which only becomes apparent and you're the fourth owner in the building, then that duty of care owed to either the owner's corporation or to purchasers within the strata plan would have continued to exist. So the Brookfield decision is in fact, and I can understand many practitioners would have been surprised, and I accept that Mackinson and Apergy would have given advice that the law needs to be changed. So I think the balance which has been achieved in relation to these amendments certainly gives again an arm to this legislation which really emphasises the intent of the legislation, and that is that it's all about consumers. This is all about the rights of consumers at the end of the day to know that the product that they've bought, and as the Honourable Rob Roberts spoke earlier about those people who have invested life savings in the biggest purchase of their life, ought to have that level of confidence in relation to the product which they've bought, and certainly if defects arise many years down the track, they should in fact have some remedy. So this is the amendments which are contained here are all amendments which are designed to give confidence to consumers, and I think that it is hard to argue that that basis for these amendments should not be supported. And I hope, in many respects, that it answers a lot of the questions that the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile raised earlier in relation to his concerns in relation to duty of care. I think that certainly this is a suite of amendments which is, I can understand, was hard fought, but the government welcomes, and I'm sure the Minister welcomes, these amendments as part of the package which will go forward for the benefit of the building industry.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The Opposition also wholeheartedly embraces the 10 amendments put forward by Mr Shoebridge relating to the duty of care. These amendments proceed on two key common sense bases. The first is that those who do the building or construction work covered by the legislation should be prepared to stand by the quality of that work for a decade, and at least as to the past and going forward as to the 6 years. In fact, and just on that, I mean, it's the usual practice that when people buy a home, whether it's an apartment or a house, it's the single biggest purchase of their life, the biggest financial investment they're ever going to have. And so these amendments also recognise the inequality in the transactions where the purchaser often buys not being able to see the defect. And then coming to the Brookvale decision, yes, it was very surprising, not just for lawyers but consumers as well. And that often happens in the law. And then legislatures have to make the difficult decisions. Yes, should we address these issues going forward? And it is more unusual to do so retrospectively. But again, I believe the justice of the case has been so persuasive because it is people's biggest purchases, and there does need to be that resurrection of confidence in the industry. Not that long ago, when Mascot and Opal Towers were on everyone's lips, and there was a block of apartments in Zetland and more in Camperdown, and it seemed that there would be no end to these revelations. I was at a lunch where a number of significant property developers were talking about there had been a plunge in people prepared to buy new apartments to the extent of 70 to 75%. It was crippling their industry, and obviously, one doesn't feel sorry for developers per se, but that whole pipeline of construction, the economic activity it represents, the people it employs, were all being jeopardised by that lack of confidence. So, in many senses, these amendments are extraordinary in that they go significantly further than legislatures are usually prepared to do. And it has to be said, it wasn't always easy to persuade everybody in this room or the gallery to do this. But again, the genuineness with which everyone applied themselves to this issue, I think, everyone is to be commended in this process. And in many respects, it would be good if the community got to see this side of politics or Parliament a bit more often. You've had a bill that's come to Parliament in the wake of crises. You've had parliamentary inquiries that have really ventilated issues. You've had all of this discussion between members of Parliament. I note the presence in the President's Gallery of the Shadow Minister, the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party, Yasmin Catley MP, who of course has spearheaded Labor's work in this space. All of this has been very complicated work, but it has all been done, and it's led to this space where we are all in agreement on the need for reform and those reforms that need to be implemented. And again, the very broad bases for these changes hopefully will speak to its longevity and to a profound change, because it is about profoundly changing the culture of the industry to raise the standards so that people can have confidence. And the first place to do that is by taking really profound and decisive action of the kind that is being sent here. I mean, no clearer signal could be sent to an industry than these changes to the duty of care. And I commend the mover of these complicated amendments, Mr Shoebridge, who is a very fine lawyer. I know everyone knows this, but it's worth mentioning that getting this right in this complicated area of law isn't easy. So I commend him for that work and everyone else who has supported the process that's led us here. So again, I hope everyone in this chamber supports these changes.
Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile.
Thank you, President. I just wish to put on the record the support of the Christian Democratic Party for these amendments, and to thank Mr Shoebridge especially for the duty of care. As someone who's just put a deposit on a new apartment, I'm very concerned to have all these protections in place.
Nothing like self-interest.
My gracious.
Always back it.
Well, Mr David Shoebridge has moved Greens amendments 1 to 10, appearing on sheet C 2020-080. The question is the amendments be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And now we come to what I believe to be the final amendment. Mr David Shoebridge.
Very short, David. Very short. We all agree with this.
Mr Chair, I move Greens Amendment number 1 on sheet 2020-069B. This amendment provides for a statutory review of the Act to be undertaken by the Public Accountability Committee of this House, and for that review to consider the functions exercised or delegated by the Secretary, whether the policy objectives of the Act remain valid, and whether the terms of the Act remain effective for securing those objectives, and also to consider the desirability of establishing an independent New South Wales Building Commission to instead exercise the regulatory and oversight functions under this Act and under other acts related to the construction of buildings. It requires that the review is to be undertaken as soon as possible after the 30th of March 2022. Provides that a report on the outcome of the review is to be tabled in the Legislative Council by the 30th of June 2022 or by later. for compromise to get a landing on this bill. And one of the areas we've had to have significant movement from, we've had to undertake significant movement, is pulling back on the amendments that we had, which had majority support in this House, and I think continue to have majority support in this House, but which weren't supported by the government, and which may well have seen this gone into a prolonged standoff, which was to insert a building commission in New South Wales. The Greens remain absolutely committed to a building commission in New South Wales. We believe that not only should there be a planning minister, there should be a building minister. And not only should there be a building minister, but there actually should be a consolidated statutory body called a building commission, which actually oversights building and construction in New South Wales. Other states have got it. Victoria and Queensland have got it. I don't pretend by itself it's a panacea to all the problems, but having one consolidated, well-resourced building commission, I believe, is going to be essential for the long-term health and stability of the construction industry in New South Wales. But we could have been dogged and stuck to that. But then we wouldn't have got the suite of changes that we've now agreed to on this bill. But also in us agreeing to pull those provisions and instead replace them with this review, it's been on the basis that the government has also now agreed to bring forward, and we'll be dealing with that on Thursday, the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Bill. And the discussions we've had have encompassed both bills. And one of the critical reasons why we're moving to a review and not insisting upon the amendments in this bill is because there has been agreement with the government that we will do a number of critical things in that residential apartments bill as well, which includes the statutory creation of a building commissioner. So rather than just being at the whim of the government, there will be a statutory obligation to have a building commissioner, not a building commission, but at least a building commissioner. And we will insist upon the building commissioner being given a clear set of statutory powers and outline what those statutory powers are. So not at the whim of the secretary by delegation, but a clear set of building powers to that, to the building commissioner as well. Again, it's not a building commission. It's still just a building commissioner, in a superhero suit running around the state doing everything he can without the support of a building commission. But taken together, we believe we've got to a point where we've pushed the government as far as we can. We've put hopefully significant advances in place, and we believe that once this plays out, once the legislation and the new building commissioner's powers get played out and we see what happens on the ground between now and the 22nd of March 2022, which will come sooner than we expect, that there will remain to be a compelling case for a building commission. And there will remain to be a compelling case to finally legislate to put that building commission in place. But we are willing to give the government a go between now and then to see what happens. And that is why I move this amendment. I think it's also important that the Public Accountability Committee undertake that review, and I'm glad to see the government will back that in as the statutory vehicle for the review, not because I particularly want to do more work in this space. I've got to tell you, my staff often say to me, David, why you spend so much time on this? The reason is I think it's actually important. I think it's actually important we do this work. So I need another review, like I need an additional hole in the head. But I do think the consistency in having the Public Accountability Committee do the review, and I think my colleagues in particular on that committee, across the board, I think have brought real value to it and have expertise now. And I think that would actually be the most useful place to do the review. And for those reasons, I commend the amendment to the House.
The Minister.
Yes, Mr Deputy President, the government supports the amendment.
Mr David, you know what to say. Yeah. Mr David Shoebridge has moved Greens Amendment number 1, appearing on sheet C 2020-069B. The question is the amendment be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that the bill as amended be agreed to. All those in favour, please say aye. Those to the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Ayes have it. Minister.
Mr Chair, I move that you do now leave the chair and report the bill to the House with amendments.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and report the bill with amendments. All those in favour, please say aye. Those the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Steady.
Mr. President, the committee reports the bill with amendments.
The committee reports the bill with amendments. Minister.
I move that the report now be adopted.
The motion of the Minister, all in favour say aye. Against say no. I believe the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister.
With the currents of the House, I move that the bill now be read a third time.
I have a certificate from the Chair of Committees that the bill is in accordance with the bill as reported from the Committee of the Whole. The question is that the bill be now read a third time. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against say no. I believe the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clerk.
Design and Building Practitioners Bill, third reading.
Move that the bill now be read a third time.
It's done. We did it.
Congratulations to the Minister in the House.
Yeah, well done.
Are you adjourning?